You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl, and if you are navigating a faith deconstruction too, or simply fascinated by faith deconstruction journeys, by religion generally and Mormonism specifically, then you are in the right place. I myself grew up Mormon, did all of the Mormon things, and then about 4 years ago, I left the Mormon church. And as I was unpacking and deconstructing and figuring things out, I realized that a lot of people were in the same boat, and also that I just had a lot to say on the subject. So here we are with a whole damn podcast. Today we are talking about Mormon funerals. Well, religious funerals. I think there's at least one other religion in these stories, a Baptist funeral, I believe we will be discussing. But I am going to read through your stories and experiences with funerals. I think that there's so much here around the funeral topic because, of course, we are talking about death and grief, and these things are huge, huge things for people, and they are also very, very deeply connected for many people to religion. So we are going to be talking about all of that today. If you're new around here, my dad died. He was only 54. He died unexpectedly of a heart attack back in December. And so on the podcast in December and January, I was talking a lot about death and navigating loss. And I talked in detail about his funeral, which, though he was inactive when he passed, was held at a Mormon church. So I talked about that at length. And then I heard from a lot of you who had stories and feelings around the topic. And I just wanted to take a break, I think, from talking about death on the podcast. So I took a long break, and now I'm feeling ready to dive into this. And of course, it is a somber subject matter, but I hope to bring some lightheartedness to all of this. I think if there's one thing that unites us as a girls' camp community, I think we all appreciate dark humor, at least to a certain extent. So it's not all going to be so somber, although we are getting into kind of a difficult topic here. Something crazy timing-wise, I've had some weird timing things happening in my life, and I will be attending a funeral probably this Saturday because my sweet, wonderful Grammy is about to pass. And she has been suffering from pretty severe dementia for some time now. So her death is not sudden. She's 80 years old and she's been struggling for some time. So I think it's a very different type of grief experience than I had with my dad, of course. But it's been really sad, obviously, and really hard to watch her struggle with dementia and to now see her truly at death's door. I went over to visit her. She's in a care home. And I didn't realize this. None of my grandparents have passed. And I didn't realize that they can pretty accurately predict when someone is about to pass. And based on vital signs, based on how much they're eating and drinking. And so we were told a couple of days ago that my Grammy would likely pass within the next few days. And she hasn't passed yet, but I did get to go say goodbye to her. I might go see her again actually in the next couple of days. And so much I could say about all of that. But I think the thing that has struck me the most is just seeing this woman who she is just the spunkiest, funniest, goofiest woman. Like, she is the type of Grammy, she always wore red lipstick and she would give us a big kiss on the cheek. We would get red lipstick on our cheek and sing us a song. She always sang, "I love you, a bushel and a peck." I don't know if you know that song. I won't sing it. I'll spare you. But she was just this really almost rambunctious woman. And to see her so fragile and small now, like physically small and just in such a different state, is really hard and really sad and has me back to, in some ways, that kind of existential place I feel like I was in for a long time after my dad died, just thinking about the passage of time and the purpose of life and all of those things. And I'm really looking forward to celebrating her at her funeral because she just has so many beautiful stories about her life. She had 6 kids. She has tons of grandkids and great-grandkids. And I'm looking forward to getting together with all of those people who have been so impacted by her. It will very much be a Mormon funeral. So I will return and report if there's anything to be said. I'm actually in a group chat right now with my cousins, and we're all going to be singing something at her funeral. So we're talking about which song we're going to sing. And it's kind of funny because they're just very Mormon doctrine-based songs, and that's fine. I just was telling Bentley, I'm like, this will be so strange to stand up there and be singing a song that I just, don't really believe in what the words are saying. But to honor Grammy, I feel okay about it. And hopefully I won't have any crazy stories like the ones that we are getting into today, because some of these are really troubling. And yeah, I just think there's a lot of room within Mormonism for funerals to go in strange ways. So on that note, let's just dive right in. Story number 1. Also, so many of these are about grandmothers' funerals, which, yeah, I don't think I ever actually circled back to the timing thing, but I actually was going to do this episode, I think a week and a half ago. I was going to record, and then I ended up wanting to do a Mormonism 101, which we did last week because of the Secret Life stuff. And then I realized a couple days after things were happening with my Grammy, I realized, I'm literally talking about funerals this week on the podcast. So weird synchronicity there. Not sure what to make of it, but so it goes. Okay, someone says, at my grandmother's funeral, the bishop told the family that we needed to, quote, keep our remarks appropriate. Like, what did he think we were going to say? I remember when me and my grandma went to the strip club and we got lap dances. It's giving me some good ideas for, I'm not speaking at my grandma's funeral, but yeah, the bishop stuff. There's a lot of stories about the bishop thing. For those who don't know, if you do a funeral in a Mormon chapel, it is required that you have a bishop preside and then be the final speaker. And I don't know, maybe there's ways that you could circumvent that if maybe like my grandpa, because he's been in high leadership positions throughout his life, I'm curious if maybe he'll be the one speaking last at my Grammy's funeral, but I'm pretty sure it has to be the bishop of the ward that you're in that has to have just the final say, which is really quite bizarre to me. The bishop is just not the most important person in most people's lives. So it feels like almost an unnecessary way of the church being like, let's remember what this is really all about. It's about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and our doctrine. And I just don't like that. As you can imagine why I don't like that. I just wish that it could be much more centered on the person. And I think the bishop speaking last is kind of a really big official way to shift it into being more about the church or Jesus or doctrine as opposed to just about this person. And yeah, asking to keep the remarks appropriate is silly. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is the infantilization that I think Mormon culture and Mormon doctrine really creates, where oftentimes grown adults are kind of being treated like kids. You shouldn't have to tell a grown adult, to this person's point, it's condescending to tell a grown adult, hey, keep your remarks appropriate at your grandma's funeral. It's like, yeah, no shit. I'm a grown adult. I understand the occasion, and I'm going to be appropriate and say what I want to say. And just the fact that that even needs to be said, I think shows how that infantilization happens. It happens in so many other ways, but even in a moment like this, it's just a very weird thing to feel like you need some man in authority to like, hey, keep things kosher at the funeral. It's like, yeah, of course. Okay, next one. Someone says, all but one of the funerals I have been to have been super LDS funerals. and you could have told me I was in a sacrament meeting and I would have believed you. It feels like you aren't allowed to be sad that the person has died, and the focus has to primarily be on the gospel and the plan of salvation, not on the person. I was at one Mormon funeral where the speaker mentioned the name of the deceased probably twice in his whole 15-minute talk. The best funeral I've ever been to was the non-LDS funeral. It was all about the man who died, his life, his humor, his character, his kindness. It was the perfect balance of fondly reminiscing on his life and mourning his death. I loved that we were allowed to be sad and that the focus of the funeral was on him and not all about the goddamn church. I hate Mormon funerals with my entire heart and soul. This was another really common story, and I think is something that any of us who have been religious can probably relate to in a big way, is the spiritual bypassing that happens when somebody dies. And a lot of the messaging in the Mormon community is you'll see them again someday. And I feel like there's some room for some sadness, but the prevailing message is it's okay because Jesus died so that we could all live together again and families can be together forever. And isn't that so wonderful that we will all get to be together again? And while that is a beautiful message for those who believe that, I do think that it does not leave much room for really not only grieving, but processing death and processing that this person is gone. Because immediately you're met with, well, they're not really gone though. And regardless of how much you believe that you will see them again, it doesn't seem very healthy to me mentally to be able to just kind of skip over the intensity of the loss of someone that you love. And this can even go so far into a really toxic positivity where people will say things like, oh, God, I've heard this when people pass like young, for example, when they tragically pass as even a child, where people will say, God just needed them up with him, or they were so perfect and pure that they didn't need to live this whole life because they had already essentially proved themselves. And so God was ready to take them back. That kind of messaging is extra bad because I just can't imagine. I mean, I'm not speaking from a place of having lost a child or having really a tragic death in that way in my life, but I just feel like if someone told me, well, yeah, isn't that nice? God just wants so badly to be with them again. I would be like, fuck God, you're taking my child away from me via death because they're too pure for this world and you want to be with them again. That would just be, I think, really upsetting to hear. And maybe it's not for some people, but I think for a lot of people, even if they don't recognize it, it seems like a subconscious way of distancing the grief and distancing the death and not allowing, again, for that real, true grieving. And I think that's such a common theme. In Mormonism, I know for sure. I'm sure that in other religions, there's a lot of that too. And that's one thing I've been grateful for, handling my dad's death. And now with my Grammy about to pass, I'm actually really grateful I get to sit with what I think is the permanence of a loss. And even though it sucks worse in a lot of ways, I feel it moving through me differently. And yeah, there's a lot about the rhetoric around death in Mormonism that's just like, well, it's not really a big deal anyway. Okay, next story. 6 years ago, my older sister passed away at 34 years old from organ failure. She had battled alcoholism and depression for a long time, which was fed largely by not living up to LDS culture standards. For the funeral, my mom knew a large part of the people that would be attending would be non-LDS. She requested to have no bishop speak and have it be family-oriented. She was told that if it was in the church building, a bishop would have to preside and be the end speaker. My mom understood and agreed, but asked for his remarks to be brief and inclusive. My siblings and I spoke, the music was beautiful, and then the bishop spoke. He started with speaking about how amazing his own daughters were and continued to tell a story about his daughter's car broke down and that either the spark plugs or battery went out. He spoke of how two, quote, Mexicans, his words, not mine, came to the rescue with jumper cables and helped fix the car. He continued to say, sometimes in the gospel you need jumper cables to start your car, aka testimony. It was so upsetting to hear the words jumper cables as my sister lay in her casket beneath the pulpit, and he talked about how wonderful his own family was. He was so smug and tone deaf, it was mind-blowing. To this day, I can't hear the words jumper cables and not get angry. My elderly grandma with dementia had to hold my mom to the bench because she was about to stand up and tell him to stop talking. Everyone was in disbelief, and so many people reached out and apologized, including the stake president and an area authority. Oh, Mormons and metaphors. Mormons and mediocre metaphors. I can't count the amount of times that I heard a Mormon man give a very mediocre, huge stretch of a metaphor where something had happened that week at who knows what, a soccer game or with the car like this guy, and they had to create a metaphor out of it and find some way to connect it to the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true. It's annoying anyway, but at a funeral for a 34-year-old woman, it is utterly insane. Yes, to the tone deafness. I think that's what's so tricky about having a bishop speak. Like I said, they shouldn't anyway, but some bishops, they probably do a decent job, and I'm sure it's a testimony about Jesus or whatever. But when you just put any old LDS bishop on the stand, I am not surprised that there's a bishop bragging about how awesome his own family is and then trying to make a weird analogy about jumper cables and testimonies. I wish that the elderly grandma with dementia was allowed to get up there and tell him to stop talking, because that's what he deserved. And I'm also glad that other people saw it and you got an apology and everything, but that's not something you can get back, right? Like this person said, there was a lovely funeral dedicated to this woman, and then this bishop just derails everything, and that's the note that you end on. It's super shitty. Next story. My grandma was a convert to the Mormon church, but at the end of her life, she started questioning the whole Joseph Smith thing and whether all the church stuff was actually true. So at her funeral, she asked not to be buried in the full temple outfit because she didn't want to look ridiculous. Instead, she was just buried in a regular, cute dress with her temple packet stuck in the coffin, just in case it was all true. Okay, so we need to talk about getting buried if you are an endowed member of the Mormon church in the temple clothing. So this is a thing if you have gone through the temple, which most Mormons do either before getting married or going on a mission. You go through the temple, you get what's called an endowment, and part of the temple ceremony, the thing that you do in there is you wear this temple outfit, and it's quite strange. If you want to see what it looks like, I'll post something on my story. I think Alyssa Grenfell has done some videos where she's showed the whole getup. It's an apron, a green leafy apron, for women a veil, for men a strange looking chef hat. And I actually don't think I fully knew that you got buried in the temple clothing until my dad died. But if you have been endowed in the church, you should be, according to the church, buried in the temple clothing. I did a quick little search on this to make sure I was right, and I found this interesting tidbit, which in 2019, so this was a change to the policy in 2019, 6 years ago? Geez, my math, 5 years ago. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has changed its guidelines regarding burying deceased endowed women, allowing the option of veiling their faces prior to burial. Quote, veiling an endowed woman's face prior to burial is optional, a letter from the First Presidency reads. This may be done if the sister expressed such a desire while she was living. In cases where the wishes of the deceased sister on this matter are not known, her family should be consulted. All endowed church members who have not been excommunicated at the time of their death should be buried in their temple clothing when they die. However, there are exceptions for when cultural traditions or burial practices make this inappropriate or difficult, in which case the clothing may be folded and placed next to the body in the casket. So that one sweet grandma questioning Joseph Smith near the end of her life was, I guess she didn't have a cultural reason not to, but I guess it's a thing where you can put the temple clothing in the packet in the coffin. The temple clothing packet is before you go into the temple ceremony. You have a packet that has the apron, the hats, like the sash that you wear, and it's in this packet. So you bring that in with you because in the ceremony you put on all of that stuff. So that's what a temple packet is. Why I read that was because I didn't realize that up until 2019, women were not only supposed to be buried in their temple clothing, they were supposed to have their face veiled. Woof. Is that not the final nail in the coffin of Mormon patriarchy? Is that Mormon women, endowed Mormon women, need, up until 2019, were supposed to be buried with their face veiled. Even in death, they had to have their face covered. And the veil is part of the temple ceremony, where there's this one part of the ceremony where women have to put their veils on. And I think it just kind of signifies like women need this protection or almost like degree of separation from God and like the holiness that is God. And I find it all terribly misogynistic. And the fact that that used to be the norm, even in death, is wild. A lot of people had a lot of thoughts and feelings about the temple garb, being buried in the temple garb. Someone said, not a story, but I just hate that our families are buried in this culty religious garb, aprons, hats, etc. An open casket is so weird when they're wearing this. Plus, the tradition of the family dressing the deceased's body in their temple clothes before, eek. Yeah, so I think that's also a thing where family members will actually dress the person who's died. They will dress them in the temple clothes. For my dad, the funeral home did it. So I don't know. I'm sure it can go either way. But before we dropped his casket, I believe a couple family members of mine, active LDS, like put on the temple hat or whatever. It was an interesting thing with my dad because there was some discussion around what he would have wanted because we didn't ask him. We didn't know he was going to die. And ultimately, my stepmom, who's an ever Mormon, decided that she thinks that he would want to be buried in the customary LDS way. So I felt fine. I mean, it wasn't my decision to make. And I don't think that she was wrong in that because I think that my dad had a complicated relationship with the church, but I don't think he probably would have minded either way. I do think the fact that it is customary to bury people in temple clothing is strange at the least and shows a high degree of control at the most. I definitely don't want to be buried in the temple clothing, which I don't think anyone would have any questions about. You know, I've made myself quite clear on where I stand, but I don't know, could be worth telling some people around you. If you're physically in, mentally out, you're still attending church. I'm not wishing a sudden death on anyone, but make sure someone around you knows that you do not want to be buried in your temple clothing, or else you probably will be. Next story. My dad died unexpectedly last year when I was in the thick of my faith transition. So I was out, but no one knew I was. Although I think some siblings had their suspicions. I'm the only one of 4 children to leave the church, but my siblings and I all served missions. I knew my dad's funeral would be a traditional LDS funeral. It's what he would have wanted. I went in full knowing there would be lots of LDS themes, plan of salvation, families forever, etc. But what got me was my dad's friends and bishop who spoke and how they just raved about how amazing of a job he and my mom did raising us because we served missions, got married in the temple, etc. Being eaten by the guilt, paired with the loss of my dad and the emotions from the funeral, led to a very complicated grieving process. I still get so bothered by people who act like the fruits of good parenting are how active your kids are in the church. Sometimes I wish at the time of his funeral it was common knowledge that I had left the church. Would they still have praised us for being good kids, even though one left the church? That would be really hard to be not even personally being praised for being a good member of the church, but having your recently passed father being praised for you being a good member of the church when you're maybe the only one who knows that you're no longer really a member of the church. Also, doing a faith transition while grieving the death of your father sounds really, really hard. I know that the death of my dad, even though I was pretty much at a good place in my faith deconstruction, like really shook up a lot of things for me. So I can sympathize with that to an extent. But if I was at the height of my faith transition and then experienced the death of a loved one, that would have been so scary. And so I'm really sorry for that. And yeah, again, like I'm just sorry that your dad's funeral had to become about you being a missionary and getting married in the temple and being a good Mormon, because as you said, that's not the mark of a good father anyway. And so much, I think, of Mormonism becomes about legacy, and kind of the best thing that you can do as a Mormon person is not only be a good Mormon, but then have good Mormon kids who have good Mormon grandkids, et cetera, et cetera. And that puts people in really hard positions when you feel like you're doing something right for you, but then it reflects on everyone else above you. I've felt this in a big way doing what I do, where I feel like now people like my grandparents feel like I'm a reflection of them. And it's twofold sad, because it's sad to feel like a disappointment or a failure, and to know that other people are feeling that way because of personal choices you've made. And it's also really sad because I do feel in a huge way like a product of, you know, my grandparents. My grandparents are all active in the church still. And I feel like I inherited so many things from them that I'm so proud of and that I love so much about myself. And those things don't have anything to do with the church. They really don't. And even though my grandparents themselves are shaped by the church in a lot of ways, I feel like the things that they have passed on are so much bigger and richer than their faithfulness in a church. They just are. And so it's also sad that people couldn't recognize that in you, because I'm sure you have so many amazing qualities and you have been shaped so much by your dad, I can imagine, but yet having that all connect back to the church and you doing church things is really reductive too. So I'm sorry, that's really, really tricky. And my heart goes out to you as someone who also recently lost their dad. It's not fun to be part of the Dead Dad Club. Although I will say that there's a lot of fucking cool people whose dads have died prematurely. And I have discovered that after having my dad die. It's not a club you want to be a part of, but it is a club full of loving, caring people. So welcome. Next story. On my Mormon mission, we attended one of our investigators, which just means someone that they were teaching, that person, the investigator's brother's funeral. This was my first Baptist funeral. He died of a drug overdose in another state. The Baptist preacher who spoke had never met this man, but spent the entire 1.5-hour funeral using the man as an example of how to live your life if you want to go to hell. The entire time, everyone in the audience was eating it up and saying, "Amen. Praise Jesus. Amen." He stood over his casket and told everyone this man was surely going to hell. No one else spoke. Needless to say, my sweet little naive Mormon heart was completely shocked. Wow. I think it's quite rare that another religion beats out Mormonism as far as being problematic, but this one takes the cake. The Baptist funeral, where only one preacher speaks and simply talks about how this person's going to hell. How's that for a funeral? How crazy that in the wake of someone's death who lived a full life full of experiences and emotions and touching other people and being touched by other people and learning and growing and all the things, in the wake of all of that, preacher can stand up there and just be like, this person's going to hell because they died of a drug overdose. And everyone in the audience is like, praise Jesus, amen. That's blowing my little Mormon mind as well. And I think it also shows the difference, obviously, between the cosmology of heaven and hell, just heaven and hell, and the Mormon version, where if someone died of a drug overdose and they were not practicing Mormon, most people wouldn't think that they were going to hell. So that wouldn't be like hanging over the funeral. In a way, yes, because they're not going to probably the celestial kingdom, but it feels like the edge is taken off a little bit than if you're going to a funeral where most people believe this person is actually going to hell. I cannot believe that so many people in this world still actually think that so many people on this huge planet who have died and will die are just going straight to eternal torment with Satan for believing different things. It's really crazy. But yeah, I guess Baptists might beat us out on bad funerals. So go Baptists. Next story. Ooh, get ready. My grandma on my mom's side passed away almost 2 years ago. Her husband, my grandpa, died when I was a kid and was the patriarch in their area when my mom was growing up. That's important to note. A patriarch, for those who don't know, it's a pretty high calling in the church, and it's a person who gives patriarchal blessings, and they are in that calling, I might be lifelong for a long period of time, and it's over like a whole region. So I would say it's a decently big deal to be a patriarch in Mormon land. Every talk at my grandma's funeral highlighted emphatically what an amazing, quote, wife to the patriarch my grandma had been. One of my uncles told a story where my grandma went into labor with her daughter and had called my grandpa at church to tell him she was needing to go to the hospital, and how comical it was for her to insist he cut his meeting short. I mean, the whole thing was an ode to my patriarch grandpa, who had been dead for like 20 years at that point. And of course, at the end, my uncle wrapped up with a call to repentance, making direct eye contact with me and stating that my grandma expected to see everybody gathered around her on the other side. It stayed with me for months afterwards. The rage at a woman who could not escape toxic patriarchal bullshit, even in the grave at her own damn funeral. Felt that big time. I think this just goes to show how deep that toxic patriarchal bullshit, as this person so eloquently said, really runs, that even in death, someone whose husband had their own damn funeral 20 years prior, this person is still being viewed in light of her husband. And this woman lived her whole own life, probably did a lot of wonderful, amazing things. And then her husband died and she lived 20 more years of beautiful, rich life. And still, it all comes down to, oh, what a good support she was to the patriarch. I'm sure there were other things said as well, but just having it centered around that is so typical and so enraging that a woman cannot be seen, even in death, as this full, independent person. They're only viewed in light of their husband who died. I didn't do any research on this, but someone did make a note that I believe it was Jeffrey R. Holland. He's an apostle in the Mormon church. His wife recently died, Patricia Holland, and I didn't follow any of it. But apparently, which I would not be surprised at all, apparently most of the funeral was not about Patricia Holland and who she was and her contributions and her as a person, but was much more about Jeffrey R. Holland, the apostle, and about the church. So I think this happens a lot. I'm sure it varies what scale that's on, but it's just really devastating. And I think really illustrative, really illustrates how that patriarchy is just embedded so deeply. Next story. My grandma passed away a few years ago. She was cousins with Russell M. Nelson, and Russell M. Nelson is the current prophet of the Mormon Church. So he was at the funeral and spoke. I was in the middle of my faith crisis and was honestly hoping for some otherworldly experience interacting with him. He's a very nice man. He got up and spoke, and at first it was incredibly comforting, talking about how her parenting, etc., would continue beyond the veil. But he then encouraged my family to, quote, live to be worthy of feeling my grandmother from the other side, i.e., she wouldn't be able to reach us if we were not perfect, true, believing Mormons. Placing conditions on spiritual connection was deeply upsetting to me, and it still annoys me when I think about it. P.S. I have since seen a medium, and we had no connection issues, and I'm not sure how Mormon my grandma is now, LOL. Take that, Rusty Nelson. You said that this person could not connect with their grandma beyond death, but guess what? She went to a medium, and she was able to. Perfectly fine. Thank you very much. This is another deeply problematic thing that shows up around death in Mormonism, is that, yes, there's this wonderful story of we get to see this person when we die and families are together forever. And isn't that so wonderful? And it is very conditional. The families together forever thing, the living in everlasting bliss in eternity with God is super, super conditional. And for someone to essentially at a funeral be holding hostage to the deceased's family, this person and their connection to this person, not even when they die, but also here on earth, by saying, yeah, there's this really wonderful thing. You can still connect with them here and after this life, but you got to be Mormon. That is holding hostage grief. That feels like it's saying, like, here's your grief, and the only way out and to find hope of reconnecting with this person is being Mormon in all the perfect ways. That's really cruel, I think. And if you were in the midst of a faith transition, it also just goes to show, like, I was thinking about this actually as I was preparing for this episode, and I was thinking about if someone came to me and said, you will see your dad again and you will see your Grammy again. This is what you have to do. Any person would do the things that you need to do as long as you're not like harming other people or whatever, or it's unethical. Like, I would do whatever I needed to do to see my dad again. Like, you don't think I would do anything to see my dad again? Of course I would. But I don't believe anymore that that's how it works. And that's what's so silly sometimes about this kind of messaging that Russell M. Nelson was giving, is like, it's not doing what you think it's doing, because I'm no longer believing that. So yeah, of course, if I thought that that's what I had to do to be with my family again forever, like, I would do what I needed to do, but I don't think that that's real anymore. And I don't know, I guess I was just thinking of like what a true believing Mormon, as they say, a TBM, might be thinking with someone like me who's vocal about leaving the church and who's experienced the death of my dad and now my grandma. And I just think they would probably think like, oh, wouldn't that lead someone back to this religion? Wouldn't that lead someone back to this hopeful doctrine of being with your family again forever? But it's like, no, because I know what's behind all of that. And now that just feels more than anything manipulative to be preaching that as a selling point when there's so much to that, when there's so many things you have to do. You know, I could rattle off so many, but one of them being supporting homophobia and supporting a church that doesn't let gay people get married. Like, it's not fair and it's not right. And especially in the wake of death, in a moment where people should be allowed to be experiencing it as they feel they should, to have someone be like, yeah, and if you ever want to have any sort of connection again, like, you better be doing all the Mormon stuff. Next story. Someone says, my grandma passed away a couple of years ago. The bishop spoke at her funeral and he said, quote, I could always count on receiving a tithing check from her. As if that was one of her most important qualities, it took everything in me not to gasp out loud. Not the tithing. Just goes to show how disconnected this bishop is from this woman's life. He's like, oh shit, I got to speak at a funeral. Oh, she always paid her tithing. Like, no, that's not, again, like, what a woman's life amounts to is that she paid her tithing to the church. Like, that's the best you can come up with is, well, she paid her tithing. What a wonderful woman for giving 10% of her income her whole life to this organization. Like, good for her. She paid her tithing. Hopefully she wanted to, and she felt aligned with paying her tithing. That's fine. But that is like not the crowning achievement that should be brought up at somebody's funeral. Okay, this next one is quite heavy. It's about the death of an infant. So I just wanted to give a trigger warning for that. You can skip ahead a little bit if you don't want to hear it. I was talking about this towards the beginning of the episode and kind of talking about some of the things that are mentioned here. I just have, before I read this, so much compassion in my heart for anyone who has experienced the death of an infant or a child. And it's one of those things where I'm like, do we even want to talk about this? It's so sad, but people have experienced that, and I think people who have experienced that deserve to also have stories shared and have that experience be spoken to. So in that vein, here is the story. When I was 14 years old, my 6-month-old cousin passed away. He had been born at 22 weeks gestation, and his lungs just never developed enough for him to make it. During the funeral, everyone just kept saying, he's in a better place, and this is God's plan, so it will all be for the best. All the while, I'm watching my uncle, shattered, standing next to his baby boy's casket. The baby's older sisters sobbing for him. And I will never get the screaming cry my aunt let out when they closed his casket for the final time. I will never get the screaming cry out of my head that my aunt let out when they closed his casket for the final time. Yet those were the only things anyone said, like God's plan made it okay somehow. I had never once questioned God or his plan or his gospel before that point. But after I was so confused and so angry that God had taken him and left all of us to pick up the pieces. Looking back, it was the first thing that ever got placed on my shelf. I hate how dismissive of grief and mourning the church is with phrases like that. I mean, for fuck's sake, why can't we just say this is awful? Nothing about grief is okay. And even if there is an afterlife, that doesn't negate our pain. I'm 24 now, and it took me until I was 18 just to accept and get over my anger about his death, and leaving the church has definitely helped. Oh, man. Yeah, I think that really horrible things happen, right? And death is one of the most horrible things that can happen. I know I've been speaking maybe kind of casually about my Grammy, but when I first found out that she was going to die, I just thought, why does anybody have to die? And that sounds like maybe childish and silly, but yeah, I didn't wear waterproof mascara. I just thought, why does anyone have to die? Death just really, really sucks. It really sucks. And it's really hard, and I don't want to speak out of turn as someone who hasn't, like I said, experienced death in that way, but I just don't think anyone should be expected to hear things like this is God's plan and it will be for the best in just probably one of the most horrific moments that, any of us can imagine. And I don't know, it's so complicated because you see why in those moments, faced with something so devastating, you see why people do cling to religion. And I don't want to judge them for that either, because I can understand that. I can understand why it would just feel too hard to, I get why people, sorry, geez. I get why people feel that way. And I do think that there's something beautiful and hopeful about having beliefs about life continuing on and there being a grander plan. And I don't mean to demonize anyone who does feel that way, but I also do think that it's not fair that people don't get to have it's almost like they're not allowed to have that amount of grief. They're not allowed to that story. They're not allowed to let it just be as absolutely awful as it is. And like this person said, I think that at least for me, moving through death, I've had to sit with how sad it is and how shitty it is in order to actually move through it. And I'm obviously still doing that in a big way. But wow, I just have a lot of sadness for people who have experienced that and just maybe not been given the right resources or had people around them not able to sit with their own grief, and then they project that onto those people too. So anyway, I'm going to read a slightly more lighthearted story to end on a little bit more of a lighthearted note. Give me 1 second to compose myself. Whew. Okay. My mom has a big family, so the room for the family prayer before the funeral was packed. So traditionally, you'll do a viewing in a Mormon funeral setup, and then everyone will leave the viewing room, and then the family will pray, close the casket, and then go to do the funeral. My sister was 17 at the time, and she has Down syndrome. We lost track of her and only found her when we heard people whispering and saw her at the front of the room in front of my grandpa's open casket, taking pictures on her phone from all different angles of his dead body in temple clothes. But it gets worse. The next day I had her phone and saw that she had a bunch of new messages. I asked if I could look at them, and she had sent the pictures of my dead grandpa in his temple clothes to every single one of her contacts. No context, just the pictures. I cry laughing thinking about the random ass people who were getting these pictures and seeing the temple clothes for the first time on my grandpa's dead body. Oh, thank you for writing that in, whoever you were. That is so funny. The all angles. It's so funny and it's so sweet. And yes, to those random ass people being like, I love that story so much and definitely needed something a little lighter. So I appreciate it. Appreciate the laugh. And thank you all for listening. I sometimes just don't really quite know. Now I'm thinking of the Michael Scott quote from The Office when he says, sometimes I start a sentence and I just don't know where I'm going. That's sort of how I feel about my episodes. And it's not because I don't plan. I plan. I mean, I have my stories. I think through what I'm going to say, but I don't always know emotionally what's going to come up for me. And I've also been kind of thinking about the level of vulnerability that I share on the podcast and just trying to be thoughtful about sharing things when I'm ready, or maybe not sharing things if, just not feeling like obliged to share things just because this is what I talk about on my podcast. And a lot of things that have to do with religion and faith are deeply, deeply personal. And anyway, I didn't know that all of that was going to come up for me, but I am grateful truly to have this time and space to kind of work through these things and to know that there's a community of people who understand. That just means the absolute world to me. I'm really appreciative. And even people who don't understand because they've experienced it, who are willing to listen with compassion and to try and understand what some of these things might be like for people who have experienced high demand religion. So that is my ex-Mormon testimony for today. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you being here. If you're interested in any bonus content, you can go to my Patreon, patreon.com/girlscamp. You can follow me on YouTube if you want to be watching Girls Camp Podcast, on TikTok, Haley Rawl, and my Instagram is back. The Girls Camp Podcast Instagram is back. So that is where we are at for Instagram right now. Okay, thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.